Welcome back. We're going to continue our introduction to hypothesis testing procedure by looking at some jargon which is related to it. There's not going to be many new concepts in this class, in fact probably none, but there is going to be some very important jargon. Important because you're going to find this jargon used in many research articles, and therefore it's going to help you figure out what they're talking about. But also important in the sense that it will hopefully shed some more light on this procedure, which, as I said last time, and I'm going to say again today, is at the beginning is not a very clearly understandable procedure. Not very convincing, but it is a sound procedure, and so it's just a matter of trying to clarify it as much as possible. Let me start with a little recap of what we did last time. So remember, first of all, that hypothesis testing is an inferential method, which means it is based on data collected from a sample, but its conclusions are meant to be applied to the whole population. The other thing to remember is that it addresses an is it true kind of question. Therefore, it's going to have as an answer either a yes or a no. Almost. We're going to find out actually that the answer is going to be yes or no, but with lots of qualifications, so not as clear cut as those karate people seem to suggest. The other thing to remember is that in order to set up properly a hypothesis testing procedure, we need to clearly identify which population we are analyzing, what is the variable that we're testing, what is the parameter we're testing, and what is the numerical question that we are looking at. And finally, we want to remember that it is addressed like a court process, a trial, where we start by assuming innocence, and then we go on to collect evidence, to analyze evidence, and then to arrive at a conclusion. Remember that it is an is it true that type of question, and therefore it has two opposite sides to it. One corresponds to one hypothesis, the other corresponds to the other hypothesis. So first of all, we have the assumption of equality. This is the assumption that we use first when we're analyzing the data, okay? And so it's the assumption that says, well, two things are equal. We're going to assume innocence, remember in the court trial analogy. This is called the null or statistical hypothesis. It's called the null hypothesis because it assumes an actual mathematical equality. It assumes that there is no difference. So the blue and the red are going to be equal. Those two colors seem to be switched around, guys. Okay, well, let's try to get better colors next time. The blue should be blue and the red should be black, and there should be red, right? Anyway, the idea here, the important idea is that they are going to be equal to each other. Sometimes this means that the value of a certain parameter is the same, is equal in two different populations, or maybe that the value of a parameter is going to be equal to some number that we think is correct. It is also called the statistical hypothesis because it is the hypothesis on which the statistical computations are made. As usual, we're not going to go through all the number crunching part, but you want to remember that all the number crunching is done on this assumption, assuming that this is true, that whatever it is we're looking at is going to be equal. Now, then there is the other assumption. That's the assumption that comes from the numerical question, what we are going to ask. And this is usually what comes first in the research process. When a researcher decides to do a study on something, they usually start by asking, is it true that this is bigger than that? We're going to call this the alternative or research hypothesis, and it's going to look like blue is greater than red. Come on, you guys, with those colors. Okay, try to stay consistent. Again, the important idea here is that we have an inequality. So something is bigger than something else, or maybe sometimes we're simply going to assume that those two things are not going to be equal. So sometimes we might say, well, the mean value in one population is going to be greater than the mean value in another population. Or we might say, well, this mean value is not going to be equal to this number that we thought it was going to be. We call this the alternative hypothesis because, of course, it's the alternative to the other, to the null or statistical hypothesis. Or we're going to call it, some people call it the research hypothesis because it is the one which usually is of interest to the researchers. It's the one that stimulates the research. Now, so let's see how this applies to our example of jumping jacks versus knee bends. Okay, so in our situation, we were checking first of all the mean heart rate after the exercise in the group that was using the jumping jacks versus the group that was using the knee bends. So the null or statistical hypothesis is that those two means are going to be exactly the same. But remember, we're not asking this, and this assumption is not about the sample. The question about whether the two sample means are equal or not, well, that's easily answered. We just look at the numbers and we give it an answer. The question is, well, given what we've seen in the sample, can we infer, can we conclude that the equality is true in the population? On the other hand, the research or alternative hypothesis in our case was that the mean for the jumping jack was going to be greater. We started by saying, is it true that jumping jacks are more strenuous than knee bends? So that is what motivated our research, our analysis, and therefore that is what the research or alternative hypothesis is.